I'm so honored to welcome Senator Manka Dhingra, a nationally recognized leader in justice reform, behavioral health, and survivor-centered policy. Since 2017, she has served in the Washington State Senate and chairs the Law and Justice Committee. She has led efforts to prevent domestic and sexual violence, improve crisis response, and promote trauma-informed public safety. Today, we will explore how smart, inclusive policy can help end violence against women and create lasting change for survivors and communities. Thank you for being with us, Senator. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's always such a pleasure for me to join you and talk about this really important topic.
And it is always a pleasure to have you as well. We are so excited to have you here. So we'll go in. You've been a leading voice in justice reform, behavioral health, and survivor advocacy, as we've mentioned, throughout your time in public service. What continues to drive your commitment to this work? And what perspective do you bring to these issues today?
I think it's the fundamental belief that everyone deserves to feel safe, especially in their own home. The home is supposed to be a place of refuge. And until everyone can feel safe in their home, I think we have to do this work. And the unfortunate truth in America is that a woman is more likely to be assaulted by someone she knows than a stranger. And this statistic has to change. And so until it does, we have to roll up our sleeves and do the work to make sure everyone is safe.
Total agreement. Thank you so much for the work you do. And hopefully we can continue to advance that work through this broadcast. So going into our next question, you've helped lead these efforts to address domestic and sexual violence, especially in the home, firearm safety, and systemic reform in Washington state. What have you learned about what it takes to make more meaningful legislation to make some progress in this space?
The first always starts with education. A lot of people who don't do this work, who don't talk to survivors, actually don't understand how extensive the problem is. And with that education, you have to make sure that especially the men in our lives don't feel like they're being attacked. So it really has to be about centering the voice of the survivor. So in the legislative field, as chair of the Law and Justice Committee, I always make sure that we start the hearing by hearing from what a survivor has to say and that personal story. And, it's challenging because every time a survivor has to retell their story, it's traumatizing for them. But unfortunately, it is these stories that help move legislation. And when you have the power of that story, you can then have someone after that survivor come and talk about how we can change that, how we could have changed our laws to make sure that she didn't go through what she did. And so really making sure you are setting up what the problem is and that the bill or the legislation is a solution to the problem. And, I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges when dealing with gender-based violence is that connection between firearm safety. We know that when a firearm is present in a domestic violence situation, the lethality risk is really, really high. And when it comes to legislation, you have to have a very, very clear narrative that it is not about a Second Amendment right. It is about making sure that only those individuals who are responsible gun owners, who do not have a history of violence, can access guns. And so really being clear that when we're trying to work on legislation to make sure, frankly, that you have domestic violence victims who can survive instead of being a fatality, you have to really, again, center it on saving lives and making sure that responsible gun ownership is tied to safe behavior and for people who don't have that history of violence.
Yeah, 100%. One of the through lines that we've been seeing in a lot of these interviews is that we have to work together against this problem, not work against each other. And I think that's a lot of what you were saying of not making it a gender difference, working with men, right, to address this issue, not against them. So I think that's a really excellent point, Senator.
And this is an issue that impacts everybody. This is not a gender issue. You have seen that in families where there is domestic violence, the children are either going to be perpetrators or victims of it. So you have to make sure you're ending the cycle of violence.
100%. And so that kind of goes into behavioral health as a topic, right? That affects everyone. And it has been a consistent focus in your work. So in your view, how do mental health and gender-based violence intersect? And what policy solutions have had the greatest potential for impact?
The intersection of mental health and gender-based violence is an area that actually needs a lot more attention with advocates and with legislators. So often we have talked about mental health issues and we've talked about gender-based violence issues, and we've had advocates working on each of these issues. But recently you've started having this cross collaboration between mental health and gender-based violence, because we know survivors are dealing with PTSD, with depression, with anxiety. And in the gender-based violence field, the focus is so much on having a safety plan and keeping the survivors safe that they tend to put on the back burner things like PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Yeah. But we now know that those issues many times actually cripple that survivor from moving forward. And so I think there's a lot more work that we have to do. But even when developing that safety plan for that survivor, you have to embed in it issues around depression, anxiety, PTSD, and have a more holistic approach. And so I think this is where we need more legislation, where maybe some of our domestic violence advocates can have that close collaboration with mental health agencies, that maybe we allow for reimbursement for medical services, and we expand the pool of people who can actually provide these services specifically for survivors of gender-based violence. So this is an area where a lot more work needs to happen. But again, it's going to take education, and it is going to take how we deliver services and who is equipped to deliver what services. So if we're going to be holistic in our approach, we have to make sure our gender-based violence advocates have the tools they need to be successful.
Yeah, and it also provides a more preventative and proactive approach when you take that holistic view of it, right? If you're able to address a lot of these mental and behavioral health issues, maybe that will also help with the issue of gender-based violence. Amazing. So, this has been incredible so far, but we have one last final question for you, Senator. What gives you hope as you look ahead, especially, in this new landscape that we're in? What are the insights and takeaways you want our audience to know about how to push this work forward and what we can do really to help victims of gender-based violence and also help prevent it?
To me, the biggest thing that gives me hope is the next generation. We have to make sure that our children are learning social emotional learning in school, that they have curriculum that teaches them about healthy relationships, that we have to make sure that they understand respect, consent, and really making sure we are teaching our girls the skills they need to have a high level of self-confidence, the ability to say no. And so this, again, is not a gender issue. This is about really making sure that everyone in the next generation, regardless of how you identify, really embodies the issues around consent and respect, because that is what it comes down to. And so to me, it is about having that dialogue, about having that education and destigmatizing gender-based violence. We should make sure that we are not victim blaming. We have to make sure we believe survivors to begin with. And this is something we as adults have to make sure we are talking about openly. And I'll tell you, every time I visit schools, every time I talk to the youth, they're just so much more aware of these issues and willing to talk about it and willing to stand up and know that they can have a different lifestyle.
I'd love to hear more about that if we have a little bit of time, but what are some of the stories that the youth are sharing with you and the insights that have really surprised you when it comes to this issue?
So, every year when I ran for office in 2017, I've had a youth campaign committee. And after the campaign ends, they actually reach out to me about policy issues. I actually go to a local high school where their AP government classes pitch bill ideas to me. And over the last few years, I cannot tell you how many of our youth have said, what can we do? What can we do to address sexual assault on our campus? What can we do to have better understanding of healthy relationships? And so Senator Orwell and I have actually worked with the high school students and our college students to address so many of their concerns. Our high school students actually wanted our school superintendents to do a survey and find out how every school district addresses gender-based violence at each school, and the results were shocking. So now we have this report, and we're working through those recommendations to make sure we're updating just the language that's being used. Because what we realized, many of our schools still had victim-blaming language. So it starts from that culture, but it's the students who reached out and said, we need this done. And so when I interact with this generation, that is what is amazing to me. And the same thing at the college level. So a lot of work being done in Washington State. We call it the Good Washington. That really involves the survivors and individuals who don't want to be survivors ever. And so we keep chugging along. Every session, we have bills that have been brought to us from the students that want to improve systems and make sure they have the resources that they need. Yeah. And so we actually just last session passed a bill that requires student ID cards to have a number that's 24/7 so that they can actually call someone to request a rape kit or just get resources if something goes wrong.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible to hear how these youth voices are really being proactive and how they can do better and how they can, help build a better culture and community for everyone. That's incredible. That really does give us a lot of hope. Thank you so much, Senator. I definitely will be following up on that report. I'd love to hear more and see more about what these youth voices are saying and continue to follow your work and what you're doing in the state Senate. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day.